Charles, welcome to 3am Conversations. Thank you so much for coming in to join us. You've given us three fascinating scenarios to talk about, and we'll come to those in a moment. But before that, a bit of background on you. You've publicly spoken about leaving school at 17, and the first executive role I could find was at Granada in 1991, I think it was. Mm-hmm. So what happened in between? Give us a bit of background.
Left school at 17, as you've said. Basically, frankly, my father had died when I was 14, and we had no money. We couldn't afford for me. I had two places, one at Strathclyde and one at Glasgow, and basically couldn't afford to go to them. Mum was almost like a single mum. My brother was 12 years older than me, sister 19 years older than me, and Mum had to go out to work when I was 14. And she got a job in the serving lunches in the dining room of British Steel. And effectively that was, nepotism was alive and well, and that's how I got my first job. She was serving what was then called the personnel director his pudding, and she overheard him talking about a pre-graduate programme. So as he got his pudding, my mother said, "Oh, Charles is a bright young lad, maybe you can get an interview." So six out of 100 got this apprenticeship program, commercial apprenticeship, and that was the start. And then basically, having done that, I worked with British Steel, 21 youngest middle manager, so that was a junior manager, and then I went on to work for various different companies in Scotland, and then I moved to London. I didn't want to move to London because I didn't want to live in bedsit land, so I moved to London to work for Gallagher's, and then I went off to the Middle East. Spent time in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and whatever for about 6 years, and then came back to be managing director of a vending company, a part of Grand Metropolitan. And then we did the management buyout of what was then, we called it Compass, and now it's a major corporation as such. And then went on to do a number of things, and then moved on from Compass to moved to Granada, and that's how I got involved in a number of other things. So 1991 was when I was appointed to Granada, and then in 92 became chief executive of Granada Television. And I'd never been in a television studio in my life before, so it's a bit like I've never been in a nuclear power plant until I became chairman of Balfour Beatty. So my career sort of follows me in retrospect, I suppose. So
what attracted you to television then, if you'd never been in a television studio in your life? Was it just the business side, presumably?
Yeah, basically we had won the franchise that, if you remember, basically back then, and this was in the 90s, 80s and 90s, there was 14 regional television stations, Granada, Yorkshire, LWT, Carlton, whatever. And basically my boss, a guy called Sir Jerry Robinson, had fired David Plowright, the chairman of the television company. And I was running what they euphemistically called in Granada, age 30, basically the leisure division. So that was motorway services, travel lodge, dodgy nightclubs, 10-pin bowling, bingo in India, reservations in America. And I said, well, I'd like a punt at this. In fact, I found the letter the other day that I wrote to Jerry and said, I know I've never been in television studio, but you've said, we're now losing money. I think I can go in and help turn it round. And I'd love the challenge. So it was the challenge rather than the industry. And if you look at all the things I've done, I love the challenge. I probably do need therapy, because it's actually, if you give me a job that can be done and it's sort of easier, or the one that's difficult, although I've got a fear of failure, I would take the one that's most difficult. I want the challenge. I suppose it's imposter syndrome because of my own background in terms of, but I want the challenge. To me, it's the buzz, the challenge really is what gets me up and out of bed in the morning, and still gets me up out of bed in the morning.
Right.
Charles, I'm probably jumping ahead a bit, but I think we're going to focus mostly on business. I think that's the plan. But I just want to make sure that before we finish, that we touch upon a couple of threads which seem to go right through your career when in and out of business transactions, but both sport and volunteering in sport.
Yep.
And I've just read some of your very passionate submissions in the House of Lords about volunteering. And obviously we know a lot about your sporting involvement with the games. And I hope at some stage in the next half hour we can touch upon those too.
Very happy to. Go wherever you want to go.
Well, that is a theme. Did sport drive you in that way? Were you a sportsman?
No, I was never very sporty, actually. I used to do cross-country running as younger. And then when I was 14, 15, I put on a lot of weight. So I actually didn't play a lot of sports, surprisingly. But I'm passionate about sport. And that's why I got involved in the Commonwealth Games. That's why I got involved in the Olympics. And that's why I'm chairing Invictus Games. So there's something special about what sport can do. And if I look at Invictus, this is rehabilitation. This is wounded, injured and sick from around the world who rehabilitate through sport and family support. So it linked into all the things that I like. And obviously volunteering was a big part of all of the games in Manchester, games in London. The volunteers were special. Our volunteers for Invictus. So that's quite a special thing for me. I'm passionate about that in terms of engaging people who give of their time voluntarily. Yeah.
And in addition to sport, you've had roles in the political sector, retail, the media, obviously. You've talked about being attracted by the challenge, but are there any other common themes that run between those different sectors? Are there particular challenges about particular sectors that you've found?
I think people look at my career, and I've been in 20 different sectors, both as executive as non-exec, and think I'm a mongrel. I'm not a pedigree, that's for sure. So effectively, for me, what's the common thread? It's all about people. The thing I've learned from an early stage is it's all about people. If you get the right people, it'll be good. I'd rather have a poor strategy and great people rather than the other way around, because you can fix the strategy, but you need to then get the right people, and the right people in the right slot. So, I've made a lot of people redundant over the years. I've changed a lot of things. But the purpose is to actually create a sustainable business in every sense, from a financial perspective, but also from a genuine sustainability perspective. So I get a real kick out of that. And also, one of the things I do now is a lot of coaching. So I coach chairman and chief execs and whatever. And that I get a real pleasure out of that. And you're not telling people what to do. What you're doing there is, if you do it well, you're holding a mirror up and saying, Peter, have you seen yourself from this angle? Or have you seen yourself from that angle? And you're just trying to help them. So I get a real buzz out of that. And I also do mentoring within my own companies, the various companies that I have. Because actually, there's real talent there. It's just giving people the confidence. And also having an open and honest conversation. The word I use is honesty, and it sounds like a soft, fluffy word. It's really tough to be honest. You have to land it in the right way, and you have to land your message in a way that you can receive. And therefore, there's lots of tactics that can help you do that in terms of actually, you talk about the good as well as the bad and the ugly. So, there's different ways to get people to open up and just share with you what you're trying to do. So that would be a common denominator as well in terms of that coaching and mentoring side of the business.
You've used the word mentor there, and I've heard you speak in terms of your relationship with your chief executives of being both mentor and tormentor. How does that work?
Well, the mentoring thing is metaphorically putting your arm around their shoulder and saying, we can do this better, can't we? Encouragement. And then I take my glasses off and look at them and say, we need to do this, don't we? So that's the tonality is slightly, find that when I do the mentoring, but the Scottish accent comes out a bit harder and a bit tougher. But no, it's that sense of actually, most people know what needs to be done. It's just giving them the nudge and the support to do it and the confidence to do it. And it's tough. I mean, the chief exec's role in organisations, whether it's a charity, whether it's a minister or secretary of state or whatever, whether it's a prime minister, is tough.
It's interesting. You speak about the challenge, which clearly turns you on, excites you. But your huge breadth of experience, do you still see a challenge, or is an awful lot of the work you're doing, as opposed to the work which you're seeing other people doing and you're mentoring them with, is that still challenging to you? Are there specific roles which you're engaged in now which are really do test you, or is it now sort of smooth running, as it were?
Yeah, I think in meetings like this, you tend to talk about the successes, but there are also things where you haven't been successful. And my most recent example is I took on the chairmanship of the British Horse Racing Authority. And what they had promised me was that we're moving from a regulatory body to a commercial body, because I wouldn't know literally one end of a horse from another. And they said that's not a problem. And that wasn't really a problem, because actually we're looking at it in terms of what could we do. And it needed fundamental change. The sector needs an amazing sector The second after football spectator sport in the UK. But not many people know that. It's not a very profitable sector at all, but it's a very passionate sector. And what I was impressed with before I took on the job is I went and saw 120 people face to face, and they all said it needs to change. But Peter needs to change, Mary needs to change, I don't need to change. And I worked on that before I actually started for about a year. And then the two things that needed to happen were we needed an independent board, because Peter's there to represent racecourses, you're there to represent owners, other people there to represent jockeys or trainers or people in the industry. And that was agreed. And then basically the other thing is we moved from being a regulator to be a commercial body. My vision for it was, if you think what's happened to Formula One from 20 years ago, where it was a static camera, ITV days, a static camera in a fast car, well, nobody would advertise around it, and it wasn't very interesting unless you were a petrol head, and then making it much more accessible. So the vision for that I wanted to bring to it was think, if you think F1, think R1. 12 fixtures around the world, the best horse in the world, the best owners in the world, the best breeders in the world, the best jockeys in the world, and around the world. So UK would be Ascot, the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, France, Dubai, whatever. And then in the UK, rather than just Royal Ascot, you could have Royal Ascot, Royal York, so 12 key fixtures. We've got 173 fixtures, and they're not very special. So actually, it needed a fundamental change to do that. And everybody agreed to it. And then right at the last minute, one of the groups, and I won't name them, basically said, well, if we approve this, we want this, that, and the other. And then one of the other groups said, well, if they're getting this, they want ABC, and we want DEF. And I said, fine, okay. And I'd started in September last year, and this then blew off in October. And I said, well, we need to sort this. And effectively, I left it. We left it. We worked for them until about February. I said, you clearly don't want to make these changes. Although you've said to me for a year and a half you want to make the changes. If you don't, I'm the wrong person. I'm not really a regulator. I don't want to be a regulator. I could be a regulator. I don't want to be a regulator. But actually, I do think you're missing a massive opportunity. So very amicably, I moved on. So sometimes the challenge, but I loved it. And actually, I was alive. I mean, my goodness, you don't get paid much for these jobs. I wasn't doing it for the money. The excitement, I was waking up at 3 a.m, literally, and actually writing things down. I thought, we need to get that one. I need to try and see this one. And I spent hundreds of man hours. It was meant to be a day a week. Literally, it took over my life. It was 4 days a week. But I loved it. There was an energy there and whatever. So to answer your question, I like the buzz of it. I like the energy of it. And I like sometimes that you can't do it. So, taking on things that people say, my God, my friend said, what are you doing, Charles? And like some of the companies I've been involved with, they're saying, why are you taking that on? It's the ugly duckling. But, there's been we've kissed a few frogs. And
it's good to hear that the challenge carries on. Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed. Well, let's move on to the first conversation that you gave to us. Mm-hmm. And this relates to the Granada ITV merger and your combat with Carlton Communications, United News and Media, which all took place around 2000 and led ultimately to the formation of ITV PLC, didn't it? Sort of monumental occasion in British television, certainly. So put those deals in context for us.
Okay. Just to set, as I said earlier, ITV was basically 14 separate companies, independent companies, with all chairman, chief execs, boards and whatever. And that sounds crazy now when you think about it, but that was the law. You could only own one license. You couldn't own 2 or 3 or whatever. And the Bernsteins, who owned Granada, decided that they didn't come from the northwest. They looked at the rainfall and they said, there's more rainfalls in the northwest than any part of the country. So therefore, and it's a true story, basically, therefore, we're going to bid for the Granada license. Fast forward, then in the early 90s, then there was a chance that we lobbied. I spent 15 years lobbying to get it from 1 license to 2 license, 2 license to 4 license, whatever. And having done a number of those, we then had bought LWT, which was a hostile takeover, very high profile. Christopher Bland sadly passed away, and Greg Dyke, who then went on to run the BBC. We had Tyne Tees, we had Border Television. So we had a group, and we were 40% of ITV. Carlton, run by Michael Green, who was the chairman, had Carlton. So Thames lost its licence. Carlton got the licence, and Michael then started to mop up others. So he had 35% of ITV. And Clive Hollick, Lord Hollick, basically had Meridian, which was basically the third piece. So we were all vying to who was going to ultimately run ITV. Now we had a very strong position with 40%. So I was at home one night. We were having a dinner party at the house, and people were starting to arrive. 7:30, the phone went, and I said, "Oh, take it in the study." So I went to the study, and this was our advisor saying Carlton and Meridian are announcing they're merging, and they will be 60% of ITV, and that the game was over. It was like, oh my God, when you have that moment. Not did I wake up at 3:00. I didn't go to sleep that night, but I do remember the 3:00 moment. We thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? I've lost it. I felt Jerry Robinson was the chief executive of Granada Group, and I was chief executive of Granada Television. And so I couldn't sleep, and I thought, what are we going to do? And the next day, believe it or not, we had a city presentation. So I didn't sleep. I had to present to the city. I was going into a meeting to present Granada, and effectively knowing that at 7:00 in the morning, the announcement would go out saying they were merging, and we were done. We were over. So that was that night. And then basically got the advisors round and said, what do we do? What can we do? So we decided, that had never been done before, to say that we were going to bid for either Carlton or United. And the logic of that is we wanted to throw it into a regulator. Then it was the Competition Commission. Now it's the CMA, to get a complete review of could these companies come together? And our argument was sort of, in the north, our rates are much lower than the south. So two southern companies coming together would completely distort the market. So long story short, what we then did was we were able to then bid for both of them. Then what happened was we were allowed to bid for both of them or either of them. We didn't have to define what we were going to pay for it. We didn't have to define which one, and we threw it into a complete competition review. And we developed this argument of the north-south divide and whatever. So publicly we were talking about north-south divide, and to the Competition Commission we were talking about this sense of, if you put two southern companies together, you create a behemoth that would actually dominate ITV, dominate television. And we won the argument, and therefore we were able to bid for Carlton and United. And I had no intention of bidding for the whole United, because I didn't want to, poor Clive, I didn't want Pig Farmers Weekly or this. I didn't want any of the print stuff. Yeah. I only wanted the television asset. So that's what happened. We then got that, and we were then 65%, and Carlton was 35%. And then fast forward again, we put the two together. The city hated it because they thought Michael Green and I were like two ferrets in a bag, and they wanted both of us to go. But anyway, our board basically said, they would only do the deal if basically I stayed and he went, which was quite painful for him. And that's how ITV was created.
Excellent, wonderful story.
You make it sound far too easy.
Oh, no, it wasn't too easy. I could tell you, I used to have hair. Now, there's really many, many late night things. Really, and also the LWT thing, I skipped over that quite quickly. That was one of the most high-profile bids, stories in the country. There was every bit of that story I've told you. There was lots of pain along the way, and then back to the deal itself. That was pretty painful, because actually, it's a particularly bit where you thought, I've lost this, I can't pull it back, and that was stressful, really stressful. And that's by the 3:00. It wasn't just one 3:00 in the morning when I heard about it. There was lots of 3:00s, because you had to then take the Competition Commission with you. We had to win their argument. We had to then come up with the strategies. So that was a period of about 6 months where there was lots of 3:00 in the mornings. So it wasn't as easy as it made it sound. It didn't quite all fall into place. And the chances we had, if you were a bookmaker, you were given us 10% chance of succeeding.
But did you ever countenance failure? Or for you, is that just can't cross your desk, as it were?
Well, I think we all forget our failures. I think I've failed so many different times, but I think it's getting back on the horse or getting back on the bike. You have to do it. And if I say I'm driven by the fear of failure, rather than the need for success. And that sounds a negative way to portray it, but it's very much that's my persona. I just think I can't give in. I've got to find a way over it, under it, round it. I've got to find a way to do it, and therefore I don't sleep until I've thought of something. And I think as you get older, you're less confident, you're less sure. Because actually, you think you're sure when you're young. I was the youngest FTSE chief executive at 35, FTSE 30 chief executive at 35. When I look back now, I thought, oh my God, there's so much I didn't know, but I thought I knew. And sometimes that's dangerous.
Of course, having battled with Carlton over that period, you ended up effectively together.
Yeah.
So how did that play out when you moved from opposition to unification?
Well, we never really got married in the end.
Right, okay.
But I think you need to do that. And I think that one of the big issues was, a great example of that was when you put you put LWT and Granada together. And the Granada team felt that they were going to dominate LWT. I kept them both separate, and I ran them both initially separately because they'd fought each other for years and years and years. So you basically had the sort of, chip on the shoulder from our people at Granada who basically saw themselves as Brideshead Revisited. They saw themselves as drama and whatever, and obviously World in Action and Current Affairs. So we were, top market, whereas they then saw LWT as shiny floor, game shows, whatever. So the cultures, and they weren't actually, because they're very good at current affairs, but that was the perception. So there was real sense, and the LWT people saw them as those bloody Northerners or whatever. So that was a big challenge in terms of how do you try and create a new entity when you've got two big, powerful, very bright people, very creative people having to come together in some way, and that took a good couple of years. And it's probably you never ever got to one culture, and therefore then we started buying other things, bought Yorkshire and whatever. So I think it's about how do you try and find the areas that are common and give them a common purpose. They might get to it in different ways in terms of the content, but how do you create a common purpose? And I've seen that when there were big mergers, which often fail because the cultures can never come together. And in your sector and other sectors, what's happening in the legal sector, lots of legal organisations coming together, lots of accounting organisations coming together in consolidation. It's quite tough in terms. It takes a lot of effort to try and then move it all on and get people on a different page when you've done it for 20 years.
Yeah. I remember talking with one consultant on a potential merger we did when I was CEO. And he said, you've got to have the business case and the culture.
Yeah.
And it's got to amount to 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't get to 9 out of 10 on both, then forget it. And we had 7 out of 10 on this one, and we walked away.
Yeah.
Remained as friends. So, yeah.
No, I think that culture point, something I believe passionately about again is that it's all about people and culture. And when I go into organisations, I don't call them human, the person that's running personnel, or I don't call it human capital. I call it people and culture. Yeah. And they're not the ones that create the culture. They help management facilitate the culture. So you actually create a culture where people can buy into, particularly if it's on the basis of companies coming together. I chaired a company called ISS, a big facility management company out of Denmark, 125 years old. And they were an amalgam of 1,000 acquisitions over a decade, 480,000 people in 55 countries. And that they were still struggling with that, although they stopped acquiring. But that was probably a really big challenge.
Yes, I can see. Well, let's move on to the second conversation, because that also relates to a monumental business deal. And that was the Forte Group takeover by Granada, which I think was about 96.
Yeah, 96.
Go back.
Yeah.
And you had one particular issue with the banks that caused issues. So again, tell us about the deal and put that in context.
So this was in the swashbuckling days of Granada, where we were a conglomerate and we thought we could do anything. We looked at buying British Airways. Glad we didn't do that. We looked at buying lots of different things, and then we alighted on Forte, which was underperforming dramatically. And we did a lot of work on it. And effectively, we were going to streamline the whole thing. It was Charlie Forte, Lord Forte, had created the business. Rocco Forte had been the chief exec for 13 years. And we had decided to bid. So on the morning of the bid, so you have to phone the target. And Jerry Robinson, who was the chief exec, myself, and Henry Staunton. So Jerry was chairman. I was the chief exec, and Henry Staunton was the finance director. So we're in the car, and we phoned Rocco's home. And we said, could we speak to Sir Rocco Forte? And we were on the speakerphone. And his butler said, and he was Spanish, Sir Rocco, here, he shooting. So that then became this. I said, Jerry, you can't leak this. You can't say anything of this. Please. And Jerry just did it. So that became the start of what was a very hostile takeover. Because it was the poor boys, Jerry from Ireland, me from Scotland, so the ruffians against Rocco with his, one of his jackets with the velvet collars and whatever. And it got really, really vicious. They had private detectives following us, we discovered later and whatever. Anyway, but before that it went public. The weekend before that, this was the Friday, this was a £3.5 billion takeover. We had 3 banks who were effectively giving £1 billion each, roughly. And one of the banks, who I won't name, but they were German, and basically pulled out. They had approval from the investment committee in the UK, and we assumed they'd had approval from the parent company. And for whatever reason, maybe for their own reasons, they pulled out. So there we are on a Friday. All this work had been done over probably an 8-month period. We'd kept a lid on it, which is unusual with these things, because usually it does leak. And I blame the bankers, because usually they leak it. Don't take me to court on that one. I'm talking to lawyers here. But basically,
we're on your side.
I would definitely want to consider my side. So basically, we thought, oh, dear God, what did we do? Yeah, how do you find £1 billion over the weekend? So effectively, we were able to find £1 billion, but that was, I didn't sleep for 2 nights, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday we had to go sleep. And we went to our existing bankers, we went to other people. We were able to then do it because everything was ready to go on the Monday morning. And that's when the call took place to the Sir Rocky shooting. And actually, we then phoned up the Forte finance director, because I said, this poor guy's going to get fired. This poor butler's going to get fired. So we then phoned the finance director of Forte, and he said, Rocco's shooting today. I said, well, maybe you can use it, Jerry. So we had a bit of fun. And I think humour's the other thing. I think to relieve the stress and whatever, my style is to use a bit of humour. Humour can really lighten the load when things get really tough. It doesn't solve the problem, but lighten the load a bit, because when it gets tense and you're punching your knuckles together, then that's when it can get really difficult as such. So that was an amazing journey to get it. And when we won it, basically they all went off to, because Savoy was part of the group, and they all went off to, Jerry and others went off, and I went home, I was ill. I went home in Benelin. They were having vintage champagne, and I was swallowing Benelin, because I knew the next day I had to start doing the job. So it was tough, but it was a great journey in terms of things that they had, the assets they had, and what you could do with them. So it was a really great journey.
I was very keen to hear about your approach to sort of financial challenges, and I think you've probably answered my sort of question, but I would just like to share with you an odd thought, which was there's a quote by one of my heroes, really, Sterling Hayden, Hollywood actor in the sort of 40s and 50s, who also, like you and like me, was a keen sailor, and he commented in one of his biography, I think, he said, "To be truly challenging, a voyage like a life must rest on a firm foundation of financial unrest. Otherwise, you're doomed to a routine traverse." And I feel you very obviously pick up on these difficult challenges and enjoy them, and sometimes have to let them go. But it sounds if that's continued throughout your career, has it? That if there's not a challenge, you may as well not.
Well, I'm not really a maintenance manager. If you want to, I had the opportunity recently to take on a chairmanship of FTSE 100, which was in pretty good shape, or another company that was quite challenged, and I took the company that was quite challenged, because actually I liked the idea of the challenge and whatever. And also I said, for me, it's challenge and people. And then how do you influence the culture, and how do you then get proper succession in place and whatever. And I took on the chairmanship of Balfour Beatty 4 years ago. And it was actually in pretty good shape, but needed to move to the next level. So the chief executive done a brilliant job. Balfour Beatty, going back a decade, nearly went bust. They were able to stave off being bought by Carillion, that then went bust. So they'd had a number of challenges, but it's a tough business. Balfour Beatty is a £12 billion turnover company that makes a 2% margin. And our business, that's a challenge, I can tell you, because any one of our top 10 contracts could wipe the company out. If we get it wrong, they call it legacy contracts, and I call it, maybe I can't say this on this, well, I will. Basically, I said they're cock-ups. I mean, you tend to have them. So how do you put the structures in place to avoid us having more legacy contracts? So that was the challenge there. And then obviously the chief exec had been there when I joined 6 years. He was seen as a very good guy, seen as a turnaround person, but what could he take it to the next level? And I said, and the board was saying, well, you need to make these changes. I said, I'm making no changes until I've got my feet under the table. Because again, I'd never been in a nuclear power plant. I had no understanding of infrastructure companies. And therefore, that was an example of there was different challenges there. And then how do you, the people that turn it round are not often the people that can then build and grow it. So recently this year, we've put a new chief exec in place. The old chief exec went off and did his next chapter. So it worked well. And that whole succession bit is really important that people don't often focus on. I think it's one of the most important things the chairman does in terms of have you got not only the right people now, have you got the right people for 5 years' time? And that has become, I think, much more difficult in the last 10 years than it's ever been. Because the rate of change, in the old days when we had 3 and 5 year plans, forget it. I've got companies where I've got 3 week plans because actually we have to respond to the dynamics of the market. And if you think of the geopolitical issues we're facing, if you look at the big challenges, up there would be geopolitical, up there would be cyber, up there would be AI, and things that, again, back to the challenges everybody faces, none of us, I certainly haven't. I never thought in my lifetime I would see war in Europe. Never. I never thought we'd see the number of wars around the world. And I see it in some ways firsthand through Invictus Games. We go to Ukraine and we see what's happening on the ground. But then you've got cyber. We had one of my companies had a cyber attack. So the good thing, and the advice to everybody is make sure you've got good insurers and the insurers literally take over. They say, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do the next thing, and they then help you through it. And if you don't do that, they won't cover you. So that's good. But they know, and they bring in pros and other people like that to help them. And strangely, when they were talking us through it, that it wasn't. Basically, they were saying they know them by name. They know the actors by name. And they said, well, this is a trustworthy activist. I thought they know their names. And they actually have Blackfile or some strange Dark Vader or whatever it's called. They know who it is and they say this is their MO, and usually it works. And it's really a world, you're dealing with criminals, but you're treating them as potential, not business partners, but people you have to do business with. And I found that really, I still can't get my mind around it, to be honest. But what I've done in all the organisations, including our charities as well, is make sure we've got the appropriate insurance in place and you move quickly. That's why cyber, for most organisations, whether you're a charity or whatever, needs to be up there in the top right-hand corner of your risk profile.
Well, let's move on to your third conversation, where you were in the limelight, whether you may have liked it or not. And that was around the 2002 Commonwealth Games in Manchester. Yeah, and in particular, you'll tell us the story, I'm sure, the closing ceremony, and what you learnt from that, in fact, for when you were next in the limelight in this context, 10 years later. But before we get to those tales, how did you get involved with the Commonwealth Games in the first place? What was the catalyst there?
Basically, a chap called Ian McCartney, who was a minister in Tony Blair's government, who was a North West MP. Ian had he had some interesting international route, but had a very broad Scottish accent, so I was probably the only person that understood him. We almost needed, when he came onto Granada Television, we almost needed subtitles. He was, I'm not sure about that one, I was already going to say that, no. So Tony gave him an international job, so I think that he did a really good job in the international. So Blair asked Ian to come and see me. And at that point in time, I was now flitting between Manchester and London because we bought LWT. So I wasn't based in Manchester. And he said, Tony would like you to take over the chair of the Commonwealth Games. Because if you look at, the UK, we didn't have a great track record of big events. Pickett's Lock, Wembley, whatever, both structurally, but also operationally as such. And, he said, Charles, A, knows the Northwest, and B, has managed some difficult circumstances. Then again, well, I don't know anything about sport, whatever. And they were, Tony was very persuasive. And I said, okay, I need a bit of money. That was the first question. I need a bit of money because I don't want, bless them, I love Manchester Police Brass Band, but that's not going to be the opening and closing ceremonies. And I need to work closely with, and obviously he knew I knew Howard Bernstein. So I think Howard and Ian had caballed to say, can you get Charles to do it? And that time I was actually living in London rather than Manchester. So that's how I sort of got involved in the whole process. And again, the challenge in terms of, the Commonwealth Games. So I took it on. It was a great buzz. And the volunteers were particularly special. I'd gone to Australia to understand what they'd done with the Olympics in Australia. And the one thing I took away from it is, the volunteers and getting that right and making them feel special. And that then carried on into 2012. So it was get the right people, get the right structure, get the right team. And that's what I did. And then you come all the way through to the games themselves. And there was a few issues, we had to resolve, particularly on the day of the final ceremony. We'd had torrential rain, such that we lost one of the generators. So a generator literally sank into the ground. We never predicted this. The generator sank into the ground, so we didn't have all the things that we needed to have. And that day I was sitting in the stand and I was hearing things and people were coming saying, well, we're going to issue with this and we're going to issue with that, we're going to issue with the next thing. First issue I had to deal with was welcoming the Queen. Before she came to the stadium, she came to see some of the operations. And the logo for Manchester Commonwealth, it was three statues basically, gold, silver and bronze and whatever. And that's what we had. But we had one of these living statues, somebody who goes into a trance and just stands there. And these were three men painted in gold, silver and bronze. So then the palace people arrived before the Queen arrived and said, because they weren't naked, but they were, they had no tops and, they obviously pants on, but it was painted blue, gold. And they said, you can't have that in front of the Queen. So I said, well, what the hell are we going to do? Because right at the front of the door, we couldn't move. There was one moment where I said, can we get a big piece of cloth and cover them up? I said, what's that going to look like? So they then said, well, we have to move them. I said, but, and the people, their handlers, if you like, said, you can't move them. They're in a trance. They could have a stroke. So we then had this ridiculous situation where we had people lifting these men who were frozen and carried out so the Queen didn't see them, and we put somebody in his place. So that was one of the things. Some of the surreal things that happened were just amazing. And I would have a 6 o'clock in the morning meeting with everyone. So with vespers, with bacon sandwiches in my room, and some of the things from the day before are the things they were facing. Anyway, fast forward to the closing ceremony. There we were. At the beginning of the week, we had a lot of complaints because we didn't have enough air conditioning. It was incredibly hot, 70 degrees. So the complaints I was getting was it's too hot in Manchester. So never hear that before. And then at the end of the week, there was this rain. And basically, the Queen was in an area that was covered, but there was sheet rain that was coming in from the side. So there was I sitting next to Her Majesty, who was wonderful. And she had one of these brollies that was see-through brollies, plastic brollies. And of course, I was sitting right next to it. So the rain was just dripping onto my suit. And she was turning around smiling, and I was smiling back at her, thinking, oh, thank you, Mum. It was lovely. So basically, we had torrential rain at the end, and I had to go up and give a speech. And by this time, my suit was absolutely soaking. But unfortunately, I was wearing a dark suit. The guy from Australia who was speaking as well had a grey suit, so you could see it was wet. You could see it was completely soaking wet, down to his pants, whatever. And I think, I had a speech, but basically what I realised is every time I said Manchester, I would get a cheer. So to cheer the audience up and me up, there was more Manchesters in that speech than I've ever said Manchester in my life as such. But it was fun, and B, it was a great success. And that then led to Tessa Giles was then, sadly she's passed away, a really good friend of mine, was a Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. And following that, we got together and said, we should bid for the Olympics. We definitely should bid for the Olympics. We can put on the Olympics. And that was the start of that process.
Right. So what did you learn then in the Commonwealth Games scenario that you think helped 10 years later?
A lot. I mean, in terms of, it's quite complicated, but people think it's quite easy, but it's quite complicated. I built my confidence in the importance of volunteers, because they were the heart of the games. They were the beating heart of the games. And also not just getting people off the street. Because of my media background, I call it casting. So if you're more introvert, maybe you want something more back of house, and if you're more extrovert, maybe they're the ones that are calling out and whatever, and really training and developing them as such, but also taking people with you on the journey. And that was, how do you get people to own the games and want the games and whatever? And that led to what I said earlier in terms of the role I had in the Olympics was nations and regions. So how did we get the nations and regions not to resent the fact they were in London, but be proud of the fact they were in London, and they were Britain's games hosted in London? That was the second thing. But I say it all comes back to getting the right team in place, getting the right people in place, really understanding that and working closely. And the Olympics was fantastic. So I did a couple of things. And in the beginning for the Olympics, my role was twofold. One, to help develop the strategy. How do you win it? And then secondly, how do you get the money? Because even in the bidding process, we needed funding. And now, when they were a great success, everyone said, oh, yes, I was happy to write checks for millions, I can tell you. I was around the country trying to sell brushes that they didn't want. They didn't like my brushes. But basically, it was that whole thing in terms of how did you win the games. Now, Paris was by far the favourite. And when we talked to people at the IOC, there was a very cosy relationship with the IOC. And it was almost a done deal. And almost when we started, even though we wanted to do it, when we started talking to people, saying, and we're really pleased you're coming in, but you'll be a nice second or third. That was a bless. It's nice to see Britain coming in for it, and that was the challenge. And my view when we strategized it is if you could be everyone's second choice, you had a really good chance of winning. So because it's first past the board, it's not first past, but basically you go from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and if you could get the right number of people on board, then that was the thinking. And then tactically, what we did is we took Blair out to Singapore. We took Tony, we took Sherry, we took Ken, Mayor of London, Ken, and we were there for 3 full days, and we had almost a doctor's surgery. So basically, they could go and meet Sherry, go and meet Tony, whatever. So you were orchestrating that. And the president of France flew in the night before. So we had a bit of a head start, and you had to get the African vote. So we spent a lot of time strategizing who did you need to get and where did we think we were. And everybody tells you they're voting for you. So if you're an IC member, they vote for everybody. So they're voting for Paris. Or no, they're voting for so-and-so. So that's an interesting one in terms of, how do you manage through that? In terms of that, and then getting a commercial thing, and then the other thing internally was Tony was very supportive. Tony's very close to Tessa. Gordon wasn't so keen on it at all, and then he was obviously Prime Minister at the time. So he was a bit dour and saying, "Oh, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to cost us money." And actually, if you look at the regeneration things that I'm pretty proud of, is the regeneration in Manchester, of East Manchester, and the regeneration of London, East London. And one of the key things was when you looked at it around the world, there was a lot of white elephants because we wanted to have a games that were sustainable in relation to the fact that there was something, there was a legacy that was a usable legacy. Whereas you went to Greece, you went to Australia, the tumbleweeds were there before the games even finished. So I think that was one of the things that I was particularly proud of, that we had genuinely, not me personally, but together we had. And so I was one of the longest serving. I was there from the beginning, and I was the last person on the committee that turned the lights off.
Yeah. Charles, it sounds quite a lot of your descriptions of Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, and the Invictus Games a relatively hands-on role. And was that very different from your chairmanship roles, where I think I've read that you say that it's very important not to get too much into the detail, but you presumably you've got to combine the two, really?
Yeah, it's engaged. I'm a very engaged chairman, but I don't do, in corporate world, I don't make any decisions. So I'm very active going out and about. I call it rattling around. So the bit I get pleasure out of is actually rattling around, but I don't make any decisions. I go to sites, I go on the M25, I chat to people. Good trick with our workers on the M25, you take them donuts, you get a lot of chat. So basically chatting to people around. So in a PLC environment, or company environment, I'm very involved, very engaged, but not executive. In the games, both these games, it's much more engaged. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm hands-on more than I would be in an executive situation. But what it is about getting great chief executive. It's getting a great team, and we had that in the Olympics. You had Seb as the chairman, Keith Mills, Paul Adeka, Paul. Yeah. So basically, just great people. So you're not that involved in the Olympics. I wasn't hands up, but I was very involved in the nations and regions thing.
And the one of the most glamorous titles you had was as mayor of the Olympic Village. So time's starting to be against us, but there must be a tale you can tell us from that run.
I had this crazy idea. So it was the best job I've ever had. So there you were, 16,000 athletes and officials, and 8,000 staff, and you were the mayor of the village. So effectively, we had our own hospital because we could do heart surgery on site. We had our own dentistry. We had our own police force. We had our own fire brigade. And you were the mayor. And they rather grandly created something for me. And I then had baby mayors as well because they used to run around and do things. So effectively, that was great fun. And basically, Tony Hall, who then was the Director General, Lord Hall was BBC, Tessa Jow was a mayor, and one other. So I had 3 assistant mayors and whatever. And then you had about 6 baby mayors. And the baby mayors were, when you're seeing things, you need to go and sort that. So when you're around, looking around. Effectively, it's like being the general manager of a big hotel. So I knew how hotels worked and how you got things done. So that was great fun. And then I had this wonderful idea that I need to be up early in the morning. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'd go to the gym. So the very first morning, there was I'm a little shorts, and I went to the gym, and only to find the world's athletes were in the gym at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the sense of inadequacy I have never felt in my life. I thought, oh, God. I was running my little treadmill for about 30 minutes. I thought, I'm not doing this. It's just too embarrassing. So I didn't go to the gym. And what I did every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, I went and met the volunteers who were coming in. So as they arrived at the arrival thing, I met them and whatever. And some of the things, what I also did was create the mayor's pin. And that was just every day we would give out 12 pins for all our volunteers. And it was like I had people bursting into tears. We're getting a little gold colour, not gold pin, because it was voted on by their colleagues. So they would vote on it, and we would. And then I would take them, 12 people every day, into the athletes' village, and they had lunch in the athletes' area. And my God, you're seeing the world's athletes, and the stories that people told were quite powerful. In the sense of why they had done it, why they were there, what they'd done, and whatever. And it was really, really powerful. And there were just some great, great memories as such. And then there was a lovely moment where basically when we were doing the opening ceremony, because I'm involved in the ceremonies committee, the opening ceremony, and Danny Boyle obviously created it, the opening ceremony was then running an hour and a half over. You can't run an hour and a half over. So it was like, and then the person who was the executive person was telling Danny Boyle, cut the NHS, said, cut this. So Danny Boyle went up the wall, and Seb phones me and said, Charles, you're going to have to sit down with Danny and see how you do it, because he's not responded to this, because he was getting really pissed off, because he knew what he wanted to do. And there was a lovely moment where, basically there was a nurse, I don't know, it was a doctor and nurses scene, that was the NHS scene. And they were real doctors and nurses, but they couldn't actually dance. So the whole thing was, we have to cut it. We have to cut it differently. So we then had to cut it into, this is the group that can dance, and the camera's going to be on them. But the reason, if it ran over an hour and a half, you couldn't get transport home. So it was a really practical reason. So having to work with a creative, which I'd done before, saying, what do you think we could do here? And rather than telling, if you tell them what to do, they'll tell you to go away. So that was another fun moment, 3 o'clock in the morning, because I was watching it. So I was doing the whole thing, and then I got home and see, get to home, my little 1-bedroom flat apartment in the village. Then you could see how it was progressing or not progressing in terms of the ceremonies and whatever. But that was a lovely moment where, God, it's an hour and a half over. So Seb said, can you talk to him? Said,
well,
cool.
It certainly worked. For those of us,
it was amazing. Really, what you did was, what Danny did was amazing.
We are in danger of running an hour and a half over as well. Charles, we are going to have to draw matters to a close.
Thank you very much.
We could talk all day. But thank you very much for coming to join us. Thank you for your words of wisdom. We shall take those away with us. And good luck with your next leisure time in whatever it may bring.
Thank you both. Thank you for your time this morning.
It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.